Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and thank you for joining me for another episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today's episode is called Beyond Belief, 10 Incredible Extraterrestrial Encounters. I love covering these humanoid cases. They're endlessly fascinating, and there are so many of them, far more than most people realize. And in fact, the vast majority of these cases go completely unreported, undocumented. And even those that are reported and investigated, most people don't know about them. That's why I do this research. I think this subject is very important. I've chosen 10 cases from all over the world, including the Czech Republic, Italy, Finland, Spain, Armenia, Kenya in Africa, New Zealand, Argentina, and 2 from the United States, including Montana and Florida. These cases are supported by, most of them, multiple eyewitnesses, as well as some very compelling evidence. The 4 main types of evidence we see, which are landing traces, physiological effects, electromagnetic disturbances, and animal reactions. The cases that I'm presenting today began as early as 1938 all the way to 2011, and of course a wide variety of humanoids. I think each and every case has something to teach us, so let's just get started. And the first case I want to talk about today, I call The Aliens and the Shepherd Boy. This occurred way back in the summer of 1938 in Munico, Spain. This is a small little village, but this is a really interesting case. This amazing and early case of a UFO landing and humanoids comes from Spanish researcher J.J. Benitez. The witness was a 7-year-old boy by the name of Mariano Melgar, and it was around noon in the summer of 1938. And Mariano was watching over his family's herd of cows. He had just taken them out to pasture in the fields about 3 kilometers or 2 miles outside of his hometown of Munico. This is near Avila in Spain. So he had just arrived, the cows were beginning to eat and drink from a small spring, and this is when he heard a strange buzzing sound, and looking up saw a bright flash in the sky. So he looked up to see what was causing this flash, and this is when he saw a round metallic object descending downwards, emitting flashes of silvery light. And it came lower and lower until it suddenly landed in the field right along the edge of the woods. At this point the buzzing sound stopped, and Mariano, now curious but cautious, hid behind an old tree trunk about 30 meters away, 90 feet, and stared at this object. He could see it was about, he estimates, 20 meters in diameter, 60 feet. It had a small dome on top, was resting on 3 or 4 landing legs. He said the perimeter of the craft had numerous blinking colored lights. The craft itself was kind of aluminum silver in color and had several round portholes or windows around the edge. As Mariano says, it was a round machine, sparkling like silver. Now at the time of this encounter, the Spanish Civil War was taking place, and Mariano wondered if he was looking at some new type of aircraft. But almost immediately, a tall and wide door opened on the side of the craft, and a long ramp came out and went to the ground. And it was at this moment that the area around him became completely silent, almost like a vacuum. Then this man came out of the door and stepped down the ramp, and Mariano was immediately struck by the man's unusual appearance. He wore what looked like a one-piece silver scuba diver's suit with a helmet. There was a squarish mask covering the face. It had a small bulge where the nose would be, same with the ears, 2 dark spots or holes for eyes, so he couldn't really see any facial features. He did notice a very short antenna-type protrusion coming from the top of the helmet. This figure wore calf-length boots, gloves, and a thick belt around the waist. So this figure descended down the ramp and was immediately followed by a second man who walked down the ramp, and then a third man emerged but remained by the door of the craft. These first 2 figures then walked a short distance from the craft and began to collect items from the ground, either soil or plants. Mariano wasn't quite sure, but he watched as one of the men knelt down and was placing specimens in some kind of bag. So now, even more curious, the witness decided to get closer, and he walked about 5 meters or 15 feet closer when the humanoid by the door fired a beam of light from an object in his right hand directly at the witness, which basically knocked him flat onto his back. But he was unharmed, a little frightened, but unharmed. He jumped up and retreated back behind the tree, and the two figures outside the craft continued to collect samples. In fact, Mariano could hear them talking in a strange, unintelligible language, which sounded kind of like gurgling to him. So as this continued, Mariano once again bravely tried to approach, and again the humanoid by the door struck him with a beam of light. This time it caused some discomfort in Mariano's eyes, he said. So it was clear to him at this point that they did not want him to get any closer. So, for the next 15 or 20 minutes, he watched as these two beings collected samples, seeming to walk around the area with some difficulty. And in fact, years later, in hindsight, when Mariano saw the astronauts walking on the moon, this reminded him of the way the men were walking. So after collecting their samples, the two humanoids returned to the craft. One of them, before entering the craft, turned and looked at Mariano, gesturing at him with what he interpreted as a wave or a salute, as if to say goodbye. This frightened Mariano because this was the first time they actually were looking at him and reacting, and he wondered if something bad was going to happen to him at this point, but it didn't. Instead, they just returned into the craft. The ramp immediately retracted, the door closed, then the craft rose up about 50 to 100 meters, 150 to 300 feet. It was rotating at this point. Multicolored lights flashed out from the bottom, and then the craft quickly darted away. Now again, at this time, Mariano had never heard of UFOs or extraterrestrials, and assumed that it had been some kind of military craft piloted by foreigners, and that it had something to do with the ongoing conflict in his country. But it quite frightened him, the whole experience, and he told nobody but a close cousin. A few days later, he did return to this site where the craft had landed, and he found a circle of scorched vegetation. But it would be many years later, when the subject of UFOs became publicized, that the witness realized he had probably seen a UFO and extraterrestrials. As he says, "Now I know that this thing had nothing to do with our war." I love these early cases, especially when the witness has never heard of UFOs or ETs, as we see in this case. It's also really interesting because this case shows the pattern we see so often of a UFO landing, ETs coming out and collecting samples of some kind. It's just overall a very compelling case. Now let's move to the next one. This one is super interesting, I think. I call this one the USO and Humanoid at Lake Langelmavisi. This is in Finland, actually. It occurred in August of 1945 at Lake Langelmavisi in Finland, and it's a really interesting case for a number of reasons involving animal reactions, a very close-up encounter with a humanoid, and a really unusual USO. USO accounts, unidentified submersible objects with humanoids, are pretty rare, and this is a good one. It appeared in the number 3-4 1970 volume of the Finnish UFO publication Vimana. It occurred in late August of 1945. The witness is Ilona Johansson Passonen. She was on vacation staying at a sauna along the shores of Lake Langelmavesi in Finland. It was before 5 a.m. and Ilona was alone in the sauna when the room suddenly filled with light. She was afraid because she was alone and the nearest house was a kilometer away, but she was also puzzled and curious, so she raised the curtain and looked out. And as she says, "There seemed no limit to my astonishment, and I received a great shock. Approximately 4 kilometers distance from the shore where the sauna is situated, a dazzling ball of fire as bright as the sun and about 10 meters in diameter was approaching the sauna at great speed. Overcome by fear, I threw myself down on the floor on my back to wait for the end. for I was sure that if the ball of fire maintained its course, it would sweep the sauna to the ground. Rushing over the surface of the lake, the ball, when I first saw it, could surely have been no more than 200 to 300 meters from the sauna, for it was already obliterating everything from view, including the small islands. Puzzled and vastly relieved, when the crash did not happen, I stood up after a few minutes to take another look at the phenomenon, but the ball of fire had disappeared. So she's now looking over this beautiful lake and was very surprised to see a, quote, dark log-like object. This was about 2 meters long, gliding through the water and approaching the shore. She was no longer afraid at this point, but was still very shocked. Looking out to the window next to a small pier that led out into the lake, she saw the neighbor's lapdog, and it was an absolute terror, standing up on its feet, all its hair standing on end. Its mouth was wide open, full of sharp teeth. But then she turned her attention back to this weird log-shaped object, which was now approaching the pier on the water, revealing itself to be some kind of craft, and there was a humanoid inside it. As Ilona says, I saw that it was a narrow boat, resembling a canoe. A tall man of slender build was standing in the prow. He was wearing a greenish-colored coverall. When the boat was just in front of the pier, it swung around so I could see that in its aft, another man dressed in a similar outfit was steering an engine which was inside a big glass bulb. I heard neither any whirring of a motor nor splashing of billows, but I observed quite a deep wake in the water. So this is clearly not a normal boat. She saw at this point that the dog was now running away, and looking back at the craft, she became even more confused and puzzled. Now, she had never heard of UFOs or aliens, so she had no idea how to interpret what she was seeing. She knew it was unusual, and it was at this moment that she says she became physically affected by the event. As Ilona says, feeling extremely weak, I returned to bed, and so failed to observe what happened to the boat. Perhaps I would have seen the fireball returning to the sky. Perhaps I wouldn't have been shocked if I had known something of these things. So it would take Ilona many years to understand that she had probably just experienced a close encounter with a USO and humanoids. But she does note that following this experience, she saw UFOs flitting around in the sky on several occasions. There you go, another case where the witness did not immediately jump to the UFO explanation, having never really heard of them. I think that does add a little bit more credibility. These are not people seeking attention by any means. And there's just, it's case after case after case. Here is another really compelling case. It's quite brief, but I think important. This one I call The Aliens at the Water Fountain. This occurred on December 24, 1950, Christmas time, at Cosuene, Italy. This is a single witness case, and the witness is a young child, but again, she wasn't thinking this was ETs. She really did not know what she was seeing. Now we know that they were probably the typical grays. This case, again, is quite brief and comes from researcher Pier Giorgio Murgia, and it occurred on a Christmas night in 1954 in the very small Italian village of Cosuene. It was just after midnight, and everyone was getting ready to retire for the evening, and the fire had to be put out. So, 10-year-old Antonietta Chiara was sent outside by her father to fetch a pail of water from the fountain, which is located about 30 feet from their home on Via Pietro Basiu. You can see the street here. So Antonietta left the house and was walking towards the fountain when she noticed 3 humanoid creatures who had very thin, elongated bodies. She estimates they were about 5 feet tall and were not human-looking, certainly not normal. They had disproportionately large heads, very large dark eyes, and all 3 of them were staring at her, which, as you can imagine, made her quite nervous. She paused, trying to understand what she was looking at, what these creatures were, and at this point it dawned on her that these were not normal humans. In fact, she wondered if they might be demons. She'd never heard of extraterrestrials. She was very afraid, ran home in a complete panic, immediately told her father what she had seen. He went outside to check, but they were gone. He did not find anything. A very brief case, but so unusual. That appears to be just a chance encounter. Hard to say why ETs would be there in the middle of a very small town, right next to a water fountain. Perhaps they were just collecting water. All beings need water. Lots of cases involving UFOs over bodies of water, ETs asking for water as well. So maybe that's what's going on in that case. Hard to say for sure, but another early and interesting case. Now let's move to another one. This one is super fascinating. I call this one The Men in the Transparent Sphere. This occurred on October 18, 1968 in Medulla, Florida. I like this case because it's got animal reactions, multiple witnesses, a very close-up sighting of UFOs and humanoids, supported by outside witnesses as well. This case was first published in Fate magazine in an article by journalist Lee Butcher. It was about 7:30 p.m. on October 18, 1968, as William Buck McMullen, his wife Julia Grace, and their soon-to-be daughter-in-law Sharon Burgess had just sat down to eat dinner in their home. This is located south of Lakeland in Medulla County, Florida. Suddenly, the television set filled with static and the audio stopped working, and at the same time their dog, who was outside, began to whimper and howl. This was very strange, as their dog was normally fearless and had in fact attacked a number of people that forced them to chain the dog outside the house. And also, the McMullens did have 4 signs posted on their property warning people about the dog. So this was a ferocious dog. But now, this dog broke loose from his chain, actually tore through the front porch screen door, ran into the dining room, and cowered in complete terror underneath the dining room table where they were all eating. So seeing this, Grace jumped up and ran outside to see what was wrong, and she immediately saw the problem. Approximately 150 feet from the house was a 30-foot wide, transparent, glass-like sphere which was hovering and rocking gently, about 10 feet above the ground, right above a palm tree. She said it had a band of blue light circling around the middle and was emitting a halo of purplish red light from the top section. Strangest of all, however, was that inside this sphere she saw 2 men. They were standing on either side, one on the right, one on the left, facing each other, and holding on to a spindle type of device, sort of a horizontal bar which was attached to a vertical bar. She said these men looked human, but were quite short, about 4 feet tall, and were wearing dull white, tight-fitting jumpsuits with high collars, skull caps, and boots. The object itself was completely silent, and Grace was really puzzled because there were no visible engines or sources of power that she could see within this sphere. She was stunned, frightened, and actually wondered for a second if she was dreaming. As she says, "I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I turned on the porch light to attract their attention, but they didn't appear to be interested." So she knew she was seeing something highly unusual and immediately became determined to carefully observe and remember every detail that she could. Moments later, she was joined by her husband Buck and their son's fiancée Sharon, and all 3 of them stood there dumbfounded watching this. These 2 men inside the sphere were pushing on this horizontal bar up and down, which appeared to cause this sphere to rock back and forth to whichever side the bar was being pressed down on. The rocking motions slowly increased and the craft began to rise. In fact, Grace had the impression that the craft may have been on the ground and that she came outside just after it had started to take off. So, as they were watching this in absolute amazement, the dog now came running outside, tearing another hole in the screen, and ran down the road howling in terror away from this scene. The UFO occupants continued to pump the bar inside this craft up and down, which seemed to cause the sphere to rise and increase in speed and eventually move off. They estimate that they watched this for a total of anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes, as this object moved off, increased speed, reached a distance of about a mile away, when suddenly there was a burst of fire and sparks, and the object took off at extremely high speed. So they immediately walked out into the field where this object had hovered, and they smelled an overpowering odor of what they thought smelled like ammonia. They returned to their home and called the police. The police arrived, but by then there was no evidence. Later they did test the area for radiation, but nothing was detected. However, there is some confirmation of this incident, because it was later learned that just minutes before the McMullins sighting, two men, Wally Simons and Larry LaRose, saw a glowing object rise from the grounds near Medulla School. This is located just north of the McMullins' house. So these witnesses thought that the object that they were looking at might be a low star in the sky, but it seemed to hover and then move left and right and then off into the distance. So clearly not a star. And also, that same week, it turns out hundreds of people were calling the local police stations throughout Tampa, located only 30 miles to the west, to report UFOs. And in fact, 5 days before the McMullins encounter on October 13 at 11:20 p.m., something very strange happened. George Wimberly, a dispatcher for the Watkins Motor Lines, said he saw this glowing object moving in a faltering, halting zigzag motion, coming downwards, seemingly not in full control, and then apparently crash into an orange grove, causing a massive explosion. And in fact, it ripped the garage doors off the building he was in, shattering glass windows and dislodging ceiling tiles. Many people in the area heard or felt this explosion. People in nearby homes dove to the ground as pictures were torn off the wall. And some witnesses described seeing a small, sort of mushroom-shaped cloud, as well as a brilliant beam of white light coming from above down onto this area as though searching for this object. Police immediately rushed to the site, and they did find a 4-foot wide, 18-inch deep hole. There was nothing in it. Soil samples were reportedly sent to the FBI, but no surprise here that there were no reports ever released to the public, and whatever that was remains a mystery. Some really interesting details to that case, with the fact that the witnesses are looking at this craft and can see right inside of it, and there's not a whole lot in there. They don't see any engines, they don't see any panels or buttons or anything really. It's just the ETs and this little lever. That's fascinating. I also find it interesting that they reported this strong odor. Many cases do involve that sort of thing. Of course, the animal reactions are really interesting. And also fascinating is that this occurred during a huge wave of sightings in this area, which always adds a level of credibility. These are not the only people reporting something going on at that time. So interesting. Now let's move to the next case, which is a rare type of UFO encounter. I call this one a UFO repair case. This is speculation, but this is what the witnesses believe was going on. This occurred in February of 1970 in Coram, Montana. This is not too far from Glacier National Park. And this is a multiple witness case, pretty closely viewed. It went on for a long time, and some really unusual and interesting elements to it. There were two witnesses to this case, Leona Nielsen and her friend. Leona is the only one who actually came forward. And again, she feels like this was a UFO that landed for repairs, which are exceedingly rare, and this could be a good example. The two witnesses had spent the day at a cabin along the Flathead River near the small town of Coram. Again, not far from Glacier National Park. It's probably one of these cabins you see here because through the process of elimination, there are no other cabins around. So it was around 1 a.m. Leona was lying awake in bed when a blazing light came pouring in through her bedroom window, bright as car headlights. But the problem was this window overlooked a completely rural area, the Flathead River. There were no roads out there. It couldn't be a car. So as Leona says, I got up, and down in the lower field was a shape, quite long, with a dome and a platform around it, and sparks were flying across the river, hitting the back and flying up into the air. I saw what I thought were two men running around my side of the platform. The lights or sparks looked like welding torch sparks, all colors. So she immediately called for her friend, and for the next 20 minutes they both watched this remarkable scene. At one point, strangely, her friend became quite ill, had to lay down, but then got up and both resumed watching this craft and these weird figures. As Leona says, "The men we saw were like Earthmen. They were about 5 feet 8, wore what seemed like snowsuits, and their heads were bare. They worked and walked as an average person. The rim, which ran around the dome, was 6 feet wide at least, as these men ran around with ease, not like one would on a narrow area. You could see them doing something near the dome. The top was so enveloped in sparks that it was only a shadow. The sparks flew from the rim up over the dome, filling the whole area with bright yellow light. The sparks were mostly yellow-white and bright blue, with heat like a welding torch. These sparks were large and would fly over the top of the dome, skim across the river, hit the bank on the other side, fly up and back into the river with a sizzling sound." So this craft, she estimates, was quite large, about 50 feet wide, but the area lit up by the sparks coming from this craft, she said, covered nearly 2 full acres. In fact, Leona said that it looked almost as if this whole area was on fire, but it was just these sparks. And that's basically it. One last thing Leona says is, "Why my friend and I didn't panic and run, I don't know. Neither were afraid." So quite an unusual encounter, to say the least. You can't say that I've heard of a case quite like that. Certainly the description of the ET craft is very familiar and quite common. But for it to be putting out all that light, all those sparks, to have these figures running around it for so long, it's a really unusual case. And again, hard to say for sure whether it was there to make repairs or what was going on, but certainly a very compelling case in that there were multiple witnesses and they did see it very close up for quite a long period of time. Now let's move to the next case. This one is also, all these cases are amazing to me. This one is particularly poignant. I call this one the ETs on the Sidewalk. This occurred on June 18, 1980 in Barrancas, Argentina. And this is a single witness case, though it does involve physiological effects and some really unusually described humanoids. It was 11 p.m. on June 18, 1980, as Antonio Gerardo D'Amico was walking along the sidewalk at the intersection of Fermat and Ituzaingó streets in the small village of Barrancas. You can see it here. This is the actual intersection. And feeling a sudden urge to look up, Antonio was surprised to see 2 short humanoids standing in front of a wall near the local coat hanger factory. He said they were very short, 1 meter, 3 feet tall, but had very muscular bodies. And as they were standing under the illumination of a nearby streetlight, he was able to see them in pretty good detail. He said both wore tight-fitting, almost luminous jumpsuits, like divers' suits. One looked more silvery, while the other did have a pinkish hue, he said. They both wore metallic boots and had Roman-type helmets with a crest on top. He didn't see any nose or mouth, but he did notice that they had large, round, googly eyes, bulging eyes. He says they stood under a window and were staring directly at him. Needless to say, this made him nervous, and he immediately moved under the protection of a nearby large tree. As if in response, the humanoid in the silver suit also moved. This is when Antonio noticed a very strong discomfort in his eyes, so he quickly began to walk away. And he turned around at one point, and he was not happy to see that both these little humanoid fellows were following him. The silver-suited one was in front, and the one with the pinkish suit was behind the first one. So now Antonio became even more nervous. He looked ahead of him and saw a parked vehicle with its lights on, so he began walking directly towards that, hoping that there would be somebody inside this car. Then, turning around again to see if he was still being followed, he saw that these two humanoids were now nowhere in sight. This greatly surprised him, as it seemed impossible that they could have disappeared so quickly. There was really nowhere for them to go, so it looked to him almost like they had vanished into thin air. And that was it. However, after the encounter, Antonio did notice one thing. His eyes were extremely red and swollen, and he also felt incredibly thirsty. That was clearly a pretty frightening encounter for Antonio. It must be quite a shock to be walking around that late at night or early morning and see something like that, and then have these humanoids following you. I wonder why they were there. I really don't know. I looked up that town. There's not a whole lot there. There is a very tall electrical tower or telephone high tension wires. We do know UFOs are attracted to that. He didn't actually see a UFO, so it's hard to say. But man, oh man, what an amazing case. Now let's move to the next one. This is one of my favorite in this little compilation. I've done a lot of research into UFOs landing at schoolyards. And that's what's going on in this case, which I call the alien robot on the school playground. This is a multiple witness case. It has some really unusual elements to it, some precursors, some after effects that are just so strange. This one occurred in mid-April in 1990 in Yerevan, Armenia. I think this is the first time I've ever covered a case in Armenia, so that itself is also interesting. But yeah, a multiple witness case of a UFO landing on a schoolyard. So many cases like this. In fact, I did write an entire book about schoolyard encounters. Didn't know about this one, so I might have to do a sequel to schoolyard UFO encounters. But I think you'll find this case super interesting. This case is a doozy. Lessons had ended for the day as 3 fourth grade students, all around age 10, were playing football on the grounds of Yerevan School number 111. You can see it here, located on the outskirts of Yerevan, Armenia. Looking up, they saw this glowing sphere drop from the sky very quickly and land about 300 meters away on a vacant lot behind the school. It's about 1,000 feet away, less. The object seemed to split in half, and it immediately disgorged 3 very tall figures. 2 of these figures stayed with the craft, while one began to approach the kids in the schoolyard. Now there were 2 fences between the figure and the schoolyard where the children stood. The first fence was about 1.5 meters tall, 4 or 5 feet. It was a metal mesh fence, and the figure easily crossed over it. But the second fence was 4 meters tall, 12 feet, and after several attempts to cross it, this figure suddenly seemed to transform into a 1 meter wide glowing sphere and bounced like a ball over the fence, rolled for a moment towards the witnesses, but as it hit the ground, it immediately resumed the form of this figure and moved towards the students. Now at this point, 2 additional students joined the first 3, and all 5 of them watched the approach of this strange figure, which they said looked almost robotic. It was 6 feet tall, had a sort of greenish metal appearance, a hue to it, a normal-sized head with square-like openings for eyes, what looked like a square grill for a mouth. There was a light on its forehead area. The upper left side of its chest had what looked to the kids like some sort of screen, and on its belly area, its stomach, was a device that they couldn't identify but reminded them of a watch. Now this is when it gets weird, because the screen on the chest of this figure, they said, flashed the names of each of the 5 children, written in Armenian. One of the boys became very frightened at this point and tried to run away, when they all watched as a beam of light came out from the light on the forehead of this robotic figure, hit the boy's hand, and knocked him over. It actually left a mark on this kid's hand. This is when a strange conversation ensued. And from what the kids said, this ET was talking to them about the future of their country, the future of Armenia. And it was during this conversation that the light on the forehead of this being emitted another beam, striking a second child and actually levitating him into the air. The boy next to this kid grabbed his leg in an attempt to hold him down, and he was also lifted up into the air. They hovered for just a few seconds and then fell to the ground. Another really strange thing was that the children said that they would periodically lose consciousness and then wake up. So this was going on for some time. They said the robotic figure continued to walk around the schoolyard, sometimes kneeling down and seeming to pick up things. They saw it once pick up a small stone with its left hand and then rubbed it on its right hand, turning it red. They said the other two figures were standing by the craft, remained there, but walked around it, apparently taking soil samples. The robotic figure that was closest to them then returned to the craft, they said in the same manner that it had arrived, transforming into this glowing sphere to surmount the taller fence. Then all three figures returned to the two halves of this sphere, which closed back up, becoming one whole sphere again. This object sort of bounced up, quote, like a spring, and then it hovered overhead, sent down one more beam of light directly onto the children, hovered for a moment, and then darted off, disappearing into the distance. Now again, at this time, the children had never heard of UFOs or ETs. The subject was completely absent from the Armenian media at this time. But this case did get a lot of publicity, and these children were interviewed by a local television show. And during this show, the interviewer asked if any of them had seen these objects before, to which one of the children replied, "Yes, these things actually fly here quite often. Look, one is flying out." And true to the child's word, everyone turned and looked, and they could see this glowing sphere, very much like the one that they had described that had just landed. So the newsman actually raised the camera towards this and filmed it. But only for a few seconds, because at this point the camera power cable became disconnected and the object disappeared. Apparently he did manage to briefly capture a few seconds of film of this sphere. This story was televised and was reportedly the first show on the subject in Armenia and really opened the floodgates for other accounts. Later, an investigation of the site did reveal footprints where this robotic figure had stood and walked around. Also, there was a deep indentation on the ground where this sphere had apparently landed. They also noticed that the ants prevalent in this area completely avoided the landing traces. They could also see a ring-shaped donut of dehydrated and faded vegetation. And an analysis of the soil was done, and it showed evidence of high heat. They also tried to grow seeds in this soil, but the soil would not grow anything, though the control sample taken a nearby distance away was normal and would grow and germinate seeds. Now the child who had been struck by the beam of light on his hand did show this mark, which actually remained after 6 months, totally baffling the doctors who examined him. Researchers also learned something else quite unusual. It was about 2 weeks before the incident. One of the children was asleep in bed when he had sort of a hypnagogic experience between sleep and waking. It wasn't a normal dream, but he says he was approached kind of in the dream state by this same described robotic figure who told him, "Soon you will be playing at the schoolyard. There will be 5 of you. We will come and talk to you." So yeah, the boy assumed it was a dream, but was it? Because this prediction did come true. And there's also this weird aftermath, because it was about 4 months after the experience, this same kid was shopping with his grandmother when an old woman called out his name and asked him how he was doing. Now the boy did not know this woman, so he asked how she knew him. And this is when suddenly the woman took on the appearance of a robotic figure for just a brief second and promptly disappeared right in front of him, into thin air. How incredible is that? Yes, these witnesses are young children, but there's landing traces left behind, medical effects. The news camera team shows up to interview these children, and what happens? A UFO shows up, and evidently they caught it on film. I couldn't find the film, unfortunately. That would have been super interesting. But again, just one of well over 100. It's probably closer to 200 schoolyard UFO encounters. I think this is something they're doing intentionally. To me, the most fascinating aspect of this case is that one of the children did get a message that he was going to be contacted at the schoolyard a couple of weeks before this encounter even occurred, and saw ETs afterwards. So something very profound and significant is going on here in these schoolyard UFO cases. Now let's move to another one, which is very similar. This one occurred in the Czech Republic. I call this one Aliens at Summer Camp. This occurred in the summer of 1991 in Pelhřimov. This is in the Czech Republic. This is another multiple witness case, not only children but adults as well, and some very compelling physical evidence as well. This very bizarre case comes from researcher Karel Razin of the Exopolitics Czech Republic. It was in the summer of 1991 that he had sent his daughter to a summer camp in Pelhřimov. This is not far from Prague. And while there, she and a group of other children had an amazing encounter. It was the last night at the summer camp, which was being spent gathered around a large campfire, singing songs, playing guitar, telling stories, like they did pretty much every evening. And the evening was winding down when around 10 or 11 p.m., suddenly, a brilliant light shone down over the group of children and the camp leaders, directly on them. Looking up, they all saw this very large, saucer-shaped craft was sending down 3 beams of light onto the ground. One directly onto the group of campers, and the other beams on either side. I said this was very bright. In fact, the environment around them was lit up bright as day. Needless to say, this caused complete chaos as everyone was gazing up at the craft, wondering what it could be. The camp leaders took immediate action and ordered all of the children to go into their tents, telling them to stay there and not look out. But some of the children were very curious and disobeyed. They looked out, and they saw that this saucer-shaped object began to descend and hover above a group of spruce trees not far away. Then this craft sort of emitted a large glowing sphere from beneath it, which moved slowly to the ground and seemed to land in the forest. Shortly later, they could hear this loud sort of roaring sound sweep through the forest, and then this craft rose up and hovered above the trees again. So very curious about this, a group of girls, including Karel Razin's daughter Petra, told the camp leaders that they had to go to the restroom. This was a lie, a little ruse, as they really wanted to go investigate the UFO. They did go to the restrooms. These were near the edge of the forest, but they really wanted to go see what this UFO was all about. So after going to the restroom and looking up at this craft, they began to return to the camp. And this is when 2 of the girls froze in their tracks, because standing on the path leading to the camp, right in front of them, blocking their way, were 3 tall white figures, dressed in what looked like spacesuits with helmets. They said these figures had boots and gloves, looked to be quite tall, 6 feet in height. Their faces were hidden behind dark faceplates, so they couldn't see what they looked like. But for the next few moments, this group of girls stared at the ETs, and the 3 presumed extraterrestrials stared right back at them, almost as if each group was examining each other. Then, moving in slow motion, these 3 figures turned around and headed back into the forest. After the figures were out of sight, the girls immediately fled back to the camp and told the camp leaders. It turned out that several of the other children back at the camp had also seen these strange figures and also watched this strange sphere ascend from the forest back into this saucer-shaped craft. The flying saucer then moved off silently and was gone. So after calming down, which took some time, everyone went back to sleep. But when they woke up the next morning, everyone got a huge surprise, because the wooden benches surrounding the campfire turned out they had been splintered and demolished into little pieces. No one could figure out how this had happened. Also, there was an axe with a wooden handle. This was also completely destroyed, except for the metal blade. So nobody could come up with any reasonable explanation as to how this could have happened. But it clearly had something to do with the unusual events of the prior night. Nothing else showed any signs of damage. Later that morning, some of the children did venture out into the forest where they had seen this sphere of light descend to the ground. It was only 5 minutes away. Arriving there, they found a strange circular pit, about 6 meters in diameter, almost 20 feet, and about 1 meter deep, 3 feet, and it had very precisely cut edges. So these are some pretty significant landing traces. These are the kinds of cases that just raise so many questions. Why did this UFO land at this summer camp? To me, I think there's some intentionality going on here, purely speculating, but the fact is, one of the witnesses is the daughter of a pretty prominent UFO researcher. Could be a coincidence, I don't know, but I find it fascinating. Also really interesting is that the evidence left behind was undeniable that something really unusual occurred. Again, most of these cases go completely unreported. I can only imagine how much more common this type of thing is than we know. Now let's move to another really interesting case. Don't hear a whole lot of cases coming out of Africa, but every place on Earth is being visited. I've shown this over and over again. There are cases from all over the world. I call this one the ETs by the Chapel. This occurred on December 27, 2006 in Nairobi. This is in Kenya, Africa. And by and large, this is a single witness case, so there were some outside witnesses who were not interviewed. So technically, I guess it is a multiple witness case. But again, a really unusual case of a UFO landing in an area where you wouldn't think it would. Pretty populated area, right next to a university and a chapel. This case comes from African researcher Samson K. Mawulolo Alija. It involves one main witness, an anonymous college student from the University of Nairobi, located in Nairobi, Kenya, Africa. It was 10:30 in the evening, December 27, 2006, as the anonymous witness was walking by the Catholic church next to the campus, chatting on her cell phone with her boyfriend. I think it's probably this church you see here, which is located right next to the campus. The only nearby source of illumination was a streetlight at the bottom of a small hill just a short distance away. And this is when, without warning, the witness's cell phone was cut off, and at the same moment, a very bright light appeared near her. Now, she first thought this was a car and sort of signaled at it to move around her. But then looking at it, this light became much brighter and closer. And suddenly, she found herself standing right in front of a very large egg-shaped craft. She said it had 5 or 6 appendages on the side of it, not really described, but she said 2 of them were pointing at her. But even more alarming was the appearance of a very short humanoid standing next to the craft. So this being was not normal. It was silver in appearance, had large reddish eyes, and it was standing perfectly still, staring directly at her. She could feel a very strong wave of heat coming from the craft. She said it was as if she was standing next to a fire. She also felt a strange vibration under her skin, and at this point found that she was immobilized, paralyzed, unable to move. And she was wondering how to get away from this frightening situation when she saw 2 figures coming towards her from the hill by the chapel. She immediately thought that these were 2 students from the nearby university, but to her enormous surprise, she saw that they were actually 2 more of these short, silvery humanoids, identical to the one standing next to the craft. So these 2 other humanoids joined the first one standing next to the craft, and then this first humanoid began to approach the witness. She said it moved very quickly, and just as it was about to reach her, one of the other 2 humanoids let out a loud cry, which sounded to the witness like an injured cat. Turned out at this exact moment, 2 students had appeared at the top of the hill, and apparently seeing this strange sight, did not come to help her, said they turned around and fled the scene. Immediately, the humanoid who had been walking towards the witness turned around and retreated back to the craft. The witness immediately found herself able to move again and wasted no time. She quickly fled the area. She again had never heard of UFOs or extraterrestrials. She wondered at first if she had encountered some type of demonic spirit, but later, doing her research, she decided that instead she had had a close encounter of the third kind. How unusual is that case? I mean, each of these cases have unique elements to it, and that one certainly does. I have to wonder what would have happened if those other witnesses hadn't showed up, because that's when the ET did turn around and return back to the craft. So this might have been a much more extensive encounter. At any rate, it's certainly one more piece of the puzzle to what's going on here. Now let's move to the final case in this compilation. This one is a wild one, really quite scary, very compelling with multiple witnesses. It's a long-lasting encounter. I call this one, The Hunters Become the Hunted. This involves 4 witnesses who were out hunting, had an encounter with a UFO that was very close up, which ended up being a humanoid encounter as well. This is a fairly recent case occurring on December 12, 2011 in the Kaimai range of New Zealand. It's a really, really interesting case. This final, very interesting and extensive case comes from researcher Ansh Shrivastava. It involves 4 witnesses, 3 hunters, John, Andrew, and Lewis, that last name is a pseudonym, as well as Andrew's 12-year-old son. All 4 of these guys were out in the wilderness of the foothills of the Kaimai Range. This is located near the Bay of Plenty on the North Island of New Zealand. And they had spent the night hunting, and at around 3 a.m. were returning through this remote scrubland area to their car located about 3.5 kilometers away. It was a windy and rainy night, and it was John who was the first to notice a strange orange light in the distance. They estimate 4 to 5 kilometers away. They thought at first it might be another hunter, so they turned off their flashlights and sat down to watch, when to their immense surprise, this light actually hovered in the sky, zigzagged violently, then swung in a pendulum motion, stopped suddenly, and started performing right angle turns. So this clearly wasn't a hunter, and they excitedly discussed all the possible theories they could think of as to what this thing might be. They thought perhaps maybe it was farming equipment or a motorcyclist, but the quick and unusual motions of the light didn't fit any of these theories. One of the gentlemen looked at it through his rifle scope and said it looked like a triangular object with 2 lights on it, but he didn't get a really good look at it because it was off in the distance, and they watched it for about 20 minutes, becoming increasingly puzzled and concerned by it, and then became even more alarmed when, without warning, this object suddenly zoomed quickly down the hill where it was maneuvering and began to move slowly across the valley directly towards the witnesses. And this is when something weird happened. Immediately as it did this, the environment around them seemed to become dark. The rain and the wind suddenly stopped, and all the creatures in the wilderness became totally silent. Normally there's sounds of all different types of animals, but nope, nothing. And as John says, we thought, oh, time to leave, boys. We didn't stick around. We started moving, rushing down the hill. I couldn't see and was falling over. So they decided to just head straight for the car, whomping through the brush until they reached a road. At this point, they could now see the light moving at what looked to them ground level, pretty close, several hundred yards away. It was now much brighter, much larger, and all the witnesses had the distinct impression it was a massive vehicle of some kind and that it was, quote, looking for something. So they continued the trek towards their car, entering into the woods at one point and losing sight of the object. They rested for a moment, at which time Andrew's young son asked what they thought the light was, but nobody knew. Yet, at the same time, none of them were quite willing to admit yet that they were dealing with a UFO. So continuing back towards the car, they noticed again an orange glow in the woods to their left, much closer this time, about 80 meters away, 250 feet. They also noticed an unpleasant smell, like rotten eggs, John said, though Lewis said it reminded him more of burnt pork. So as they continued to walk, this strange light suddenly went out. All the animal sounds started again, it began to rain again, and it looked like everything was back to normal. Still, they were quite unnerved by what had just happened. As John says, we didn't feel safe. We all had that flutter, that feeling that something was not quite right. So continuing towards their car, they came to a break in the trees, and now about 60 meters away, 180 feet, they saw this same light again, and it immediately zoomed directly towards them. As John says, we thought, what the hell is that? And within a split second, it was right along the fence line, only 5 meters away from us. Again, the wind and the rain stopped. All the wildlife went deadly silent, which Lewis described as, quote, surreal and frightening. Now this terrified the 4 men. All of them froze and watched as this orange light faded to reveal a cone-shaped craft hovering just above the ground. It was clearly metallic, highly reflective, sort of flattish on top, was studded with colored lights, green, blue, yellow, orange, red, and white lights, arranged in tiers, and they were flashing erratically. The bottom part of the craft was covered with very small orange lights, and on one side were 2 brilliant white spotlights, kind of like headlights, but very bright, inset into the side of the craft. And although all the lights were very bright, it was strange because they did not illuminate the environment around them. The craft itself was silent, but they did see this arc of red light coming out from the bottom, which would sort of move out in front of the craft as if scanning the area. And when it did this, it would make this weird ticking sound. So John, as he says, I said to the boys, are you seeing what I'm seeing? I could hear them breathing heavily right behind me, and we were just staring at this thing. It stayed there for a good 10 seconds, and then the red light went out and reversed. So at this point the object began to move away and the light went out. Everyone felt a brief sense of relief. John says he felt abnormally calm and comfortable, which was bizarre to him considering the circumstances. But again, their relief was short-lived because suddenly this craft reappeared 150 meters away. They said it made a noise, kind of like a vacuum cleaner, and then it moved and it blocked their forward path. Then, to their great fear, it zoomed again towards them, stopping only about 15 meters away. This caused complete panic. John, Lewis, and Andrew's son dove off the path into the bushes. In fact, Lewis wrapped his arms over the 12-year-old boy to protect him. He was quite frightened. Meanwhile, Andrew, the boy's father, quickly turned the light off of his phone and moved to join the others, but tripped. And this craft continued to move directly towards him. As Andrew says in his own words, I was looking up at it as it was approaching. I remember seeing colored lights on the road, but the mass of bright white light was what stuck in my head because of the fact that it was so close. I was actually wondering whether to run back up the road, but it would have seen me. So I said to the others, just stay there, don't move. Everybody was freaking out. I couldn't help but think, what will it do if it sees me? Will it attack? Will it take us? So yeah, everyone was very afraid. This was totally out of the realm of their experience. Andrew's son actually shouted out to his father, I love you. Andrew looked briefly at his son and then back at the UFO, which immediately turned off all of its lights. Now a split second later, they saw it again, but it was now 350 meters away and moving gently off over the field. That was bizarre. It moved so quickly. Immediately it began to rain again. The wildlife began making the usual night noises. Now the group now at this point was pretty close to their car, 250 meters, 750 feet away. So they just decided to make a run for the car. And as they did, all of them became aware of this foul odor where this ship had hovered. Andrew's son was crying at this point. So Andrew and his son were in the lead while John and Lewis took up the rear. And this is when John saw a bright, small, football-shaped glow off to the left. It seemed to be moving up and down, and it stopped about 1.5 meters above the ground. And as Andrew says, we all stopped to look at it. Everyone was saying, look, look. My son was pulling me, crying and saying, "Dad, let's go." So I took him off down the road. I left the other two boys standing there. So at this point, the light began to waver and come closer. They later realized that this was a figure sort of walking, and that was causing the wavering motion, because John shone his powerful flashlight at this light and was shocked to see that the light was actually the illuminated head of a tall humanoid. It did not appear to be wearing any clothes. It had pale grayish-white skin with mottled grays and pinks. Only the top half was visible as the rest was hidden by bushes. But the being continued to approach, swaying back and forth, in what looked to the witnesses like an attempt to shield itself from the flashlight. So John was very curious and moved forward to get a better look. But his friend Lewis quickly grabbed him and pulled him back, and the two men decided to hurry back, retreat, and go after Andrew and his son. But while they did this, John continued to look back at the humanoid, which was still there. But when they reached the car, it disappeared. They could no longer see it. They all quickly got inside the car, talked excitedly, comparing notes about what they saw, trying to explain it away. They couldn't. It was clearly unusual. After a few moments of recovering from the shock of the encounter, Andrew started the car and drove off. They said afterwards all of them felt traumatized. They were alternately trying to explain away what happened while at the same time going over and over the details and realizing just how unusual this encounter was. I have to give kudos to the witnesses for coming forth to talk about this. Again, most people don't. I really feel for the 12-year-old kid who had such fear associated with this encounter. I can't blame him. When somebody has an experience that is completely out of their worldview, it can be quite difficult to process. But the fact is there are so many of these cases. And I know there's a lot of controversy about why ETs are here. Is contact beneficial or not? I mean, I'm just presenting the cases factually. You can make up your own minds about it. But I think if ETs were truly here to harm, hurt, take over, we would already know by now. Fact is, they've been here since recorded history and probably a lot earlier than that. I think if you take a close, objective look at ET contact, particularly the on-board encounters, you will see that there is no real clear evidence that they're here to hurt people. I think if you take a look at the totality of evidence, it's very clear what their so-called agenda is. But you can make up your own minds about it. This is why I present these cases factually, with no agenda to push one narrative or another. It's important that we all use discernment to figure out what's going on here. Don't believe me. Do your own research on these cases. I'm telling you, there are so many. I've literally presented well over 1,000. It's closer to 2,000 cases now on this channel alone. And again, this is just a small representative sample of what's going on. So thank you once again for watching. I hope you found this interesting and perhaps educational as well. I truly appreciate you guys watching. This subject is so important. I think it has the potential to really change the entire world, how we view ourselves and our place in this universe. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And until next time, keep asking those hard questions, keep searching for the truth, and keep having fun. I will see you next Friday. Bye for now.